So today's feature segment is Priveillance. And Priveillance is an idea from our fellow cyberpunk, one of the original cyberpunks, Steve Mann. Steve Mann was one of the original cyborgs. Steve Mann has been a cyborg now for, I'm pretty sure, 40 years, since maybe the early 80s, but in his defense, might have been the late 80s. He's literally, I gotta pull this up here before I go to Priveillance. Steve Mann is, to say he's a pioneer is an understatement. To say that, Steve Mann is the OG, the original cyborg, is also a bit of an understatement. But, Steve Mann is a legend in that Steve Mann, on the one hand, has immersed himself in technology. So he has been using augmented reality for 40 years now. He, in the 80s, was wearing... Yeah, here he was. Let's get a big version of this photo. Sorry, he changes this stuff so much. It's hard to... He's such a cyberpunk. It's incredible. Yeah, so you can sort of hear... Here he is in 1980, wearing a helmet as a wearable computer. And then the mid-80s, in the early 1990s, he put more of it into a hip sack. By the 90s, he had it into around a backpack. And by the late 1990s, he had it into glasses. The last 20 years, he's had it very much integrated as his iTap device that blasts light directly into his brain. I mean, here he is one of his more recent photos. This guy's the original. He's the original cyborg, the original cyberpunk. When I was an undergrad at U of T, I studied under him. He really is a legend. And one of the reasons that, he is a hero to all of us is because he believes in privacy. And he believes in surveillance, in countering the powers of surveillance. And I kind of feel that that's relevant when we talk about vaccine passports and we talk about pandemic-related surveillance. I did, however, just want to quickly address our good friend Panda Smiles, who says, I think it's just to quell all of the paranoid Karens who need proof of vaccination. And tragically, you're right. And, I think that may be the role of vaccine passports, but I don't want to indulge the Karens. Even though if you remind me at the end of today's show, I'll tell you about a story of today and how I became a Karen today. And I feel really guilty about it. So maybe in doing a confessional, it will liberate me. But back to exploring this concept of Priveillance that our good friend Steve Mann, with some of our other friends at the McLuhan Center, has just put together. And Priveillance is equivalence and COVIDized surveillance and dark surveillance. Now that's a mouthful. And you may be asking yourself, MetaViews, what are you talking about here? Steve Mann, what are you talking about here? You gotta explain this stuff, please. And big shout out to Rhonda McEwen, by the way, who's another fantastic researcher that we know. David Naylor's all right. I got no beef with him. All these folks are really great. They've done great work here in trying to play with the word surveillance. And so Steve Mann points out, and this is using a diagram from Stephanie, age 6, that surveillance is oversight, or oversight from above. And surveillance is undersight. It's like watching the watchers. And I used to engage in a whole lot more surveillance than I do now. In urban environments, I used to track where all the cameras were. And I used to turn the camera onto the camera as an act of surveillance. And this was something that I learned from our pal here, Steve Mann. Now, equivalence is fair, just, and equal sensing at the intersection of surveillance and surveillance. So it's when it's not above, it's not below, but it's kind of peer-to-peer. It's like when we're watching each other. So maybe a Discord chat is an example of equivalence, where we're all looking to each other. So here's an example. It is important to remember that surveillance is not the same thing as countervalence. For example, a person can be in favor of both valences, i.e. in favor of equivalence, or a person or organization can favor one valence over the other, or be opposed to both. The valence graph, or valence compass, illustrated below shows this concept. So here you have anti-surveillance versus pro-surveillance, and pro-surveillance versus anti-surveillance. And this then shows you a different range of political positions that you could have in relation to valence. So if you're in favor of surveillance and in favor of surveillance, that makes you an equivalent, or in favor of equivalence. Which, if you were in favor of surveillance, but you're opposed to surveillance, i.e. you don't want anyone watching the watcher, that means you're in favor of McValence. And if you're against surveillance and you're against surveillance, that puts you into countervalence. You're against all valence altogether. And this is a really interesting intellectual exercise. Let's see how this connects to priveillance, shall we? Now here's an example, or a graph, of the urban scale space. So this is everything from surveillance and surveillance, environment and environment. From things like your body, your clothes, to your neighborhood, your street, and different levels of surveillance. Now here we go. Priveillance is our broad encompassing series of inventions, protocols, and best practices. Priveillance is at the intersection of surveillance, surveillance, and privacy. So for example, here you have a Venn diagram in which surveillance, surveillance, and privacy all overlap. Where surveillance and privacy overlap, you get security. Where privacy and surveillance overlap, you get security, which quite frankly, I'm not sure what that is. And where surveillance and surveillance overlap, you get equivalence. And so the Venn diagram where all three overlap, that's priveillance. I don't know about you guys, but my head's starting to hurt as I try to crunch all this, but I get it. Right? It's that sweet spot between the three of them, between security, equivalence, and security. Here they define equivalence, which is like peer-to-peer surveillance. I know, random dude with internet. I'm struggling to follow along as well, but I think here's what we're getting into it. Human plus machine equals machines. And this is how you got to remember that Steve Mann is a cyborg. So he's thinking about this in the context of being half man, half amazing, or half man, half machine. And so everywhere Steve Mann goes, he's conducting surveillance because he's wearing a camera. And he's often conducting surveillance because he hates surveillance. So he's often looking at cameras that are looking at him. And so he's anticipating the human wearing a machine, therefore a machine, recording data, living in a smart city in which the human machine is gathering information about the smart city, which is gathering information about the human machine. We have arrived in the future, random dude with internet. We're now part of the surveillance society in which the society is spying on us and we are spying on the society. What comes first? The chicken or the egg? The spy or who's being spied upon? So I'm going to read this paragraph. The human mind and body form a feedback loop with efferent and afferent nerves. Today, humans and technology are inextricably intertwined. We wear technologies like shoes, clothing, wristwatches, and eyeglasses that are getting more and more technologically advanced. Thus, most of us today are machines with senses that are augmented by sensors. This forms a fractal, self-similar architecture where our technologies function like our nervous system in a way that not only senses us, but allows us to sense. This reciprocal nature of sensing and being sensed should occur at every physical scale. When we convene in cities, the city itself is a machine of sorts that senses us. This is where we must also advocate for equivalence, i.e. to also have surveillance, to be able to sense and not just be sensed. Ho, ho, ho! And welcome, Chris. And yeah, we are tripping out in the feedback loop of surveillance, of valence. So obviously this is a huge subject that we are going to have to come back to in the future, but I'm going to scroll down here and read a little about priveillance, because that is the subject here of priveillance. At the intersection of privacy and equivalence is what we proffer to call priveillance, i.e. the boundary between sensing and not sensing, seeing and not seeing, in the service of humanity. Ultimately, priveillance is what we wish to strive for, taking into account privacy, security, and trust, as well as security and reciprocal trust. Our world contains large numbers of sensors, example surveillance cameras, as well as cameras inside devices like light fixtures, street lights, hand wash faucets, and other appliances. I'm skipping a sentence in which he describes these. Surveillance systems are not well understood by the people beneath them, i.e. their subjects. At present, the devices are only understood by those watching from above, i.e. the machines or large entities like governments and corporations watching us. Surveillance tends to have associated with it an inherent hypocrisy, i.e. we're watching you, but you can't watch us. Those who study surveillance are often told that photography is prohibited. See, for example, photos that say, or signs that say no photos, can't take photos. So I'm just going through the surveillance, commercial applications. So unfortunately, they haven't really fleshed out the concept of prevalence. They're leading up to it. They're creating these philosophical building blocks, but they kind of step short on what they mean by prevalence. So I'm going to read this last example here. Examples of surveillance systems are systems that are auditable or understandable by the general public and by end users. Our prevalence effort provides and builds upon a number of research contributions based on surveillance systems, and we can form an important business enterprise around systems including this is a mouthful, alethiometric systems, i.e. systems that function as alethiometers, i.e. truth meters, not record, i.e. being able to retroactively ask permission to record something in the past. Example, being able to get permission to record an excerpt from a movie or event or crime that you saw last week. Sight field compliant imaging, imaging that adheres to standards of public auditability by any one member of the public. Auditable sensing, and smart world IoT and wearables. See also related invention, alibi surveillance, cryptographic two-way timestamping, which is another Steve Mann invention. And this is where I will mention that Steve Mann is an honest-to-goodness cyborg. So the technologies he's creating, he's doing because he's anticipating future cyborgs like himself, like themselves. Now, I think Priveillance as a concept is in its infancy. I think Steve, in working with his colleagues at the McLuhan Center, has really come up with some pretty crazy stuff. I think this is a subject we're going to have to return to. If I'm going to try to summarize it, because I admit, like Random Dude with Internet, my head was kind of hurting as I was sort of reading with that. But it's, how do we carve out privacy in a surveillance society, right? What is the form of privacy in a participatory surveillance environment in which there is no big brother, but there's little brothers and little sisters who are each armed with cameras surveilling everything they see? And this happens if you're in an urban environment. You start acting out, people are going to bring out their phones, right? If you're driving, now most cars have dash cams and they're recording you doing whatever you do. So the idea of privilege, of privacy within a surveillance society, Random Dude with Internet argues you don't, that's impossible. But I'm not so sure. I would argue that it may not be accessible. It may not be universal. But insofar as there are cyberpunks, insofar as there are hackers, we will know how to hide in plain sight. We will know the disguises, the makeup that fools facial recognition, the jackets, the clothes that avoid camera detection. These methods exist the same way that hackers can enter a system and leave no trace. The question is, how do these abilities, how does this knowledge become available to everyone? So we might have a democratic society rather than only available to the powerful, or in this case, to the technologically powerful, i.e. us cyberpunks and us hackers. I offer that as a philosophical question, but one that we will have to look to again in the future as we revisit this concept of priveillance, and a big shout out to our friend Steve Mann for putting together what I think is a really fascinating concept.